Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The latest advances by Assad's forces raised a question on whether the 7-year civil war in Syria nears its end. To further discuss this topic, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir, Oren, and Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the latest developments in Syria.
We see two movements in that direction. One is political, what you might call a trilateral conversation between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. This is why it's trilateral. T for Turkey, R for Russia, and I for Iran. And note that Syria and the Syrian opposition are not considered part of that discussion because eventually they are going to be dictated to by these three powers. This is all under the auspices of the United Nations, Staffan de Mistura. It is happening in Geneva, where expectations are low, but the trend is positive. So this is the direction there is to establish a constitutional committee which will reflect all segments of society in Syria, and they will try to divide power in the newly emerging Syria. So this is the political part. Militarily, we see the Assad regime, helped by its allies, bolstering its position, first of all, in the capital, Damascus, and its environs, and then moving towards the southwestern part bordering the Israeli-held Golan Heights. There is also a problem with the Jordanian border, and a week ago or so, Mike Pompeo and Sergei Lavrov talked on the phone on this particular problem. Perhaps even Benjamin Netanyahu's visit with King Abdullah II had to do with that, because both Israel and Jordan are fearful of that breach in the wall. And what is probably also going to happen is that many of the Islamic State fighters around Damascus are going to be led to the southeastern border, the Iraqi region, and north to Idlib, because apparently Assad has decided that his control over the Damascus area is more important to him, and he's sending them to fight another day in another region.
Dr. Lerman?
Yes, I agree that down in what we would call the Israeli border area, we are nearing what could be the end game, depending, of course, on the nature of the regularization. People talk in Hebrew about the term hasda. It doesn't lend itself to an easy translation, regularization or arrangement between Israel and the Russians. The safety of Jordan is very important in this respect, and this has also been determined in another tripartite agreement, the American-Russian-Jordanian agreement, to which Israel is, let's say, a silent but a very important partner. This is all happening down south. Up north and out east, I think the war is far from over. Idlib is not that much of an easy target. The American-dominated areas in the east, which are under Kurdish leadership, as the Syrian Democratic Forces leadership, will not easily submit to any rule, neither Assad's nor Erdogan's, nor Iran's for that matter. And we see this in action over the last few months. So Syria is far from, it's not about to become a happy, unified family once again by any remove. But our dilemmas, our problems will now focus on our immediate environment in the south.
Dr. Boms?
Well, there were a number of wars involved in the Syrian arena, and when we're asking if the war is over, we have to ask ourselves, which war is it? Is it the civil war? Is it the war between the different factions? Or is it the proxy war that involved it? Or it's the regional war for hegemony and influence? And of course, some of these wars are certainly in a very different phase, and in some ways are close to a certain end. It is true to a certain degree to say that Assad had won the war, or really that the war was won for him by the Iranians and the Russians. On the other hand, when we're looking at the regional arena, some of these wars are only at the beginning. The proxy wars that Syria had been a central arena for are very much in motion. The Saudi or the Sunni Shia war is very much still at its peak and will continue to do so. And Syria has been and still is an arena for it. Some of the arenas that are not completely sealed in the north, in the east with the Kurds, we have not seen the last part of that war, and we still have Turkish forces in the northern part of Syria, and we have a very significant dilemma in the southern border, and perhaps we'll spend a few minutes on that as well later on. And the last point has to do with the forces, with the Syrian forces that are now coming to sort of control the new Syria. Are they really Syrians? The Syria that we have now, the Syria that emerging in front of our eyes is a very different Syria than the Syria that we have seen before. It's different demographically, it's different politically, following 7 million Sunnis that are gone out of Syria and an influx of a certain number, not completely sorted, of Shia fighters, militias and their families. We're looking at a very different demographic balance that exists there. And that means that there's another chapter begins, and that chapter may continue to create different dynamics, perhaps an end of one war, but a beginning of another.
Mr. Oren?
The most frustrating fact for an outside observer is that we are really back to biblical times with Persia and Assyria and Babylon and of course Syria is a derivative of Assyria, Aram, Madai, and all of these ancient cultures, because there is no clear delineation between Syria and Iraq, for instance. And we see that when the Kurds are not successful in Syria, they concentrate their efforts in Iraq. And when they are not in the Kandil area, for instance, between Iraq and Iran, if they are not successful on that side of the border, the PKK, they go to Iran, and the Turks go to the Iranians in order to fight the Kurds there. So even if the Syrian civil war ends officially, formally, as Nir said, the fight will go on because the tribes there, or the inhabitants in general, or movements such as the Islamic State, know no boundaries. And the Ottoman Empire tried to put it, to make districts out of these areas. And then, of course, the mandatory powers, Britain and France, tried to reshape the area. But here we are, back to the drawing board, and it seems as if the drawing board is biblical.
Well, it also seems that we have reached a point of battle of arrangements, if you will. As Dr. Lerman noted, with regard to the arrangement between Moscow and Jerusalem on the matter of the Iranian entrenchment on the border area with Israel. Of course, there's still question marks with regard to how much are the Shiite militias, including the Lebanese Hezbollah, tentative to Moscow's demands. But, of course, there are things still maneuvering, and the superpowers are the ones to decide, as you say, Mr. Oren, with regard to the biblical analogy. The thorn from Persia and the bear from Russia are indeed with their claws deep inside the Syrian war. But we have also the Geneva discussions, which Staffan de Mistura, as you mentioned, has also announced American support now, and they have agreed to become an integral part of this process, something that seems more favorable on the Russian side, but less so on the Iranian side.
Yes, because it is not one-dimensional. One cannot say, okay, I won, you lost. It's not zero-sum. The Americans have two goals, and only two goals. One is to defeat ISIS, Daesh, and the other one is to go home, to pack up and go home. For that, they need a stable Syria. A stable Syria means Russian and even Iranian and even Hezbollah help for Assad. So Israel is in a strange position where it doesn't want the Iranians to be entrenched there with forces which could attack Israel. That is drones, surface-to-air missiles, and the like. But it does want the Iranians to help Assad stay in power.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, officially the Israeli position is 0 Iranians. But since we are talking to the Russians, the quick answer to this is, if we, the Russians, go to Assad with this request of yours, then his position would be, give me 2 Spetsnaz divisions to cover for the loss of the people who have been fighting and dying for me, because my military is finished. However, the Russians have their own calculations. And one interesting factor that is coming in right now into the equation is what looks like a major shift in Russian-Saudi relations. Syria was, among other things, a playground of the cruelest sort for the rival ambitions of the Russians and the Saudis, who are maybe between them the most important players in the world energy markets. And now there seems to have been reached, on the 14th of June, a grand deal on rising prices.
You mean when Mohammed bin Salman and Vladimir Putin watched the first game in the World Cup?
They didn't do much for Saudi reputation, but I'm sure it gave Putin a lot of pleasure. But beyond that, the Russians are the main winners, because at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia has deep pockets. Putin cannot hold the country indefinitely when oil price is below 50. So if there is a Saudi-Russian understanding, that puts Iran and Iranian ambitions in Syria in a very different corner. For the Saudis, Assad is an enemy. They will not, I believe, acquiesce in a total Assad victory. Locally, yes. Generally, no, and that complicates the equation even further.
Dr. Boms?
Well, I'll certainly agree, and kudos for President Putin. When you're looking at the Syrian chessboard at the beginning of this war, what you're seeing is a good number of factions, proxies, players, and when you try to chart them, figure out who is fighting each other, sometimes you really get crossed. Following the Russian intervention and the Russian game in the last 3 years, things have changed dramatically. And we have seen it politically as well. And what we've seen now in Geneva is a very interesting testament for this. Because at the beginning, if you're looking at the number of channels we had a Saudi channel, we had an Egyptian channel, we had a Turkish channel. Each of these channels had meetings, arrangements, opposition. All of a sudden, what the Russians were able to do is center things towards Sochi and Astana, and then bring it back to Geneva on the main channel, which now they control, because the opposition groups that are present in the negotiations are the one, for the most part, are approved by Russia and, by default, by President Assad. And therefore, the majority of the political process is now in the hands of the Russians. Now they're negotiating a constitution based on a draft that was written in the context of the Astana process, which became really the main negotiation vehicle, with the agreement of all the other players going to Geneva. This does not necessarily mean that they will reach an agreement with the opposition, but there is a chance that they would reach something, because, again, the people who are bringing the players to the table are the ones who are able to stabilize the situation, and there is a certain understanding that this is perhaps the only way out of this.
Well, if you look at the diplomatic history, in 1991, following the first Gulf War, or the second one if you consider the Iran-Iraq War a Gulf War, there was the Madrid Conference, and following that, the Washington talks between Israel and several Arab parties. Israel controlled the list of Palestinian members in the joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. It was a very strange arrangement by which one party says who can represent the other party. And here we have the Syrians, Assad, and the Russians controlling the list of opposition members who are going to sit across the table for them, which means that Russia is calling the shots either through Assad or directly. Of course, right now it's in the deputy foreign minister, on the deputy foreign minister level from Turkey, Iran, and Russia. But it's really Vladimir Putin who can pick up the phone and tell Assad, this is what I want, And this is what.
And on the other side, you have Stefan de Mistura give the seal of approval by saying, we want 30% women, and we believe in the opposition, and we're the United Nations, and I believe that we can be cautiously optimistic that something will emerge from all of this.
You cannot bring a Western moral level to an Eastern battle of conscience. Dr. Lerman, to what degree is there a viable solution? I mean, at some point when we had the Sochi discussions and the Russians really built mountains of hope and asserted somewhat of a light in the end of the tunnel, if you will, everything crumbled in a minute the moment the opposition decided not to show up. To what degree is this reality now with Western backing and various arrangements, as we noted earlier, with the Saudis, with the Iranians, with different parties as well as the Turks? Can something emerge out of this?
Well, it's very difficult to tell, given that the Russians have, as we all agree, established a commanding position. So they can basically now navigate every major party towards something that would look like a solution. But would it really be a solution? Well, first of all, I don't think it will produce a unified Syria. It will produce zones of control that matter to Assad, the south, Damascus, the contiguity to the Alawite areas in the north, areas where the Sunni loyalists can feel safe, and areas which have been depopulated from their Sunni, traditional Sunni populations, and now will be repopulated by Alawites or even by Shia from outside Syria. But this is not going to be the Syria that we knew, and it's not going to be all of Syria. Moreover, the more one-sided the outcome is, the less likely the Sunni majority in other parts of Syria will be to actually acquiesce in it. They may accept it for the time being. The level of violence may go down, but Syria coming back to be a unified state in the traditional sense is, I think, irretrievably impossible.
Do they have a choice, however, considering the fact that the Assad regime has gained almost all territories lost in the area of Damascus, with rapid advances on eastern fronts as well as northern fronts? The moment the Americans leave, what will stop the Assad regime from taking that too?
Well, in the north, I think the Turks intend to sustain the capacity of the Sunnis to hold on to significant areas. They will hold on to their enclave they conquered in Afrin, and they will do.
And the Kurds will hold other parts.
And I'm talking right now west of the river. They will hold Idlib or something like the Idlib area, because simply they have no wish to see millions more pouring helplessly over the Turkish border.
To the level of annexation?
That I doubt very much.
Security zone.
A security zone, a kind of agreed Russian, Iranian, Turkish carving up of the loot, but not in any formal sense that would go again. That would put
Iskandarun.
That would put Turkey on a very unhappy ground from the point of view of the West. East of the river, the SDF are a formidable force. I don't see how they can be undone. Of course, when the Americans leave, the game could change, but maybe not quite as dramatically as some people think. And I'm not sure the Americans are leaving in the fullest sense of the word. The U.S. military has probably indicated to Trump that they're willing to bring down the level of commitment in that area, but to bring it down to zero would be a mistake.
Dr. Boms?
And the result of all of this is Syria becoming more proxy than it used to be when it comes to in relations to the Russians. And interestingly enough, in Hebrew, you just have to change one letter, the order of one letter, in order to change it from Syria to Russia. It works a little bit different in English, but it's really sort of shows something about the proximity of things. And all of these arrangements and agreements and regularization process has to do with a de facto stop for the war. Because part of aside of all the unresolved issues, we also need to understand whether there is going to be a cessation of fighting. And we have seen more cessation of fighting in more areas. We have seen the beginning of constructions. We have seen even beautiful pictures from the last few weeks from Eid, from the end of Ramadan in Damascus. We've seen new contracts of rebuilding Syria. We've spent some time in this program speaking about that. So we've seen a beginning process of looking toward the future. Of course, this is what Assad and some of his allies, who also have a vested interest in getting involved in some of these contracts, particularly when it comes to energy, to gas, to resources, and also broadly to influence. This is what they have in mind. But de facto, the rebels were depleted. They had lost power. Many of them were literally, as Dr. Lerman had said, had been moved away. And the people who are going to take their place are going to be people who are going to be more loyal to the Assad circle and to the Russian circle. The Russians, and we've seen that in the last few weeks, have been taking more active positions and given advice, commending. We've seen Russians briefing the Syrians before they go into war. We've seen Russian military police arresting Syrians, soldiers, when they're doing things that they thought are not appropriate in terms of public behavior. So we're seeing them on the ground and then giving the message to all the other players. We are able to bring stability to this, and if you wish stability, work with us.
Mr. Oren, we hear a lot the word demographics, the number or the shifting number of populations, each one from its own group. Let's talk about the fact that President Bashar al-Assad for years has been the guardian of the minorities, the guardian of the Christian population in Syria, the Druze population in Syria, the Alawites, which are also his people, but all those minorities have always looked up to the Assad family in order to receive protection from the Sunni majority. To what degree now that there is a significant shift and the Shiites are becoming closer and closer to be the majority in what once was a Sunni country, to what degree then will he continue to be the guardian of the minorities? And, of course, there's been several reports about Assad's already showing favor towards the Christians and building churches that were destroyed under the directives, of course, from Moscow, which is a very Christian-oriented country. To what degree is this going to show somewhat of a shift?
The change in equilibrium, which you pointed out, is similar to what happened under other circumstances in Lebanon, where there was a facade of Maronite hegemony, but the Muslims, and especially the Shiites, later emerged taking their rightful place. So this could happen here. Now, we are not at the end yet. The American strategic thinker Frederick Lay once wrote a booklet titled "Every War Must End," which is, of course, obvious. And the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War finally ended. The question is, what mechanism are you going to use towards that end in order to shape it for your interests? Now, first of all, we don't know the demographic makeup of the new Syria for two reasons. 465,000 people were killed. It seems as if the parties are waiting for around 500,000, for another 35,000 people to be killed before they end. So many people, millions have been displaced, refugees or internally displaced. We don't know whether they will go home and where they will live. If you look at another place, South Africa, after the apartheid, the majority tribe or tribes won, and therefore, with this truth and reconciliation process, managed to pacify the country. But here the minority, the Alawites, even though it is also helpful to the other minorities which you mentioned, the minority is still going to be in control, and the majority may not be satisfied. What can they do about it? Are they going to keep a war of attrition for years on end? At least in the beginning, it doesn't seem this way. But one has to see whether Bashar Assad personally, not the Assadist regime, but whether Bashar Assad will survive. Because maybe the Russians will remove him and install someone else who would be more amenable to the other groups.
Dr. Lerman?
I'm not quite sure about that. There's a limit even to the Russian ability to manage in great detail the outcome. You know, when countries try to do this, we've had our own experience in Lebanon. This can end very dramatically and very quickly. The Assad clan has created the political system in Syria, on what is left of Syria, in a way that basically makes it essentially a hand grenade. You pull the Assad pin, and the thing blows apart. And so I'm not sure that the Russians have a ready alternative from within the Alawites, and that any attempt to impose something else as a result of the war could ignite another war. So Assad, for all his despicable weaknesses and drawbacks, is probably what we are going to have to deal with for a while. From an Israeli point of view, that does not cause us any joy, but at least we know what we are up against.
Dr. Boms?
We'll add to that the Iraqi experience, which is a good reminder. Following the fall of Saddam, there was an attempt to, in a way, start anew. Let's remove the old infrastructure. Let's remove the military and the elite that controlled the country. And soon enough, it was a realization that it didn't really work. That when
Sunni enough.
Sunni enough as well. And as a result, then we have seen lack of stability that really continues until really this very day in many ways. So yes, stability is the name of the game, and this is really the Russian promise. But if I'll jump to the Israeli dilemma on this, this presents a very important set of dilemmas, but one of the most significant one is the dilemma of the South. What will happen to the zone of influence that Israel had really de facto operated in the South? Israel touched a very significant number of Syrians with medical aid, with the various different types of supports, some would say with operational support, and all of them are really, this is one of the last remaining enclave of rebels. And we're beginning to see an attack come in their way, which will put Israel in a very interesting dilemma.
Closing sentence?
Well, I think that if that's going to be the case, Israel will need to act smartly. And also take some responsibility for this zone of influence, making sure that it's not going to be portrayed as another ally that had betrayed its friends.
Dr. Lerman?
Yeah, I agree, and we've written together a piece about it at the JISS. The point is this: it may seem like a short-term calculus to say, well, they've lost, well, we have no obligations toward them. But the long-run calculation in terms of Israel's position in the region would indicate that we need people to think of us as reliable friends.
Mr. Oren?
There was a report in the Israeli press a couple of weeks ago that several ministers in the Israeli cabinet are approaching Washington in order to recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights. And then there was another report that Prime Minister Netanyahu told this minister to shut up because it is not in Israel's interest to have the fate of the Golan Heights come up in discussions on Syria's makeup.
And we'll have to discuss more about this topic and, of course, about Israel's involvement in this matter. But this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Dr. Lerman, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Boms for coming here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.